Thank you for joining us. We're going to spend today talking about E-2 visa options where the investment amount is low and risky cases. So a few things before we get started. Some of you may know that Scott Legal was founded on an E-2 visa many years ago. Our founder is on an E-2 visa, and we have also renewed this visa and can share this experience. The firm is a full service immigration firm, but focuses primarily on E-2 visas. We've processed hundreds of them, and we primarily process E-2 visas that are higher risk, meaning lower investment amounts. We will continue our webinar series doing, at least 2 webinars a month and often more on different immigration topics. And at the end of this webinar, we'll send out a few things. So one is the PowerPoint presentation you'll see here today. Another is a comprehensive E-2 visa guide, and then also a link to where you can sign up for additional webinars. So for the panel today, my name is Kelly Weiner. I'm a partner at Scott Legal, and I will be handling the presentation. I processed hundreds of E-2 visas in my career and have significant experience in this area. If you have questions during the presentation, please send them through the chat box. We'll try to make time for questions at the end of the presentation. And also this webinar is being recorded and will be available. And I would also encourage you to check out our YouTube channel where there's many videos on various immigration topics. So now we'll get started. All right, let's talk a little bit about the E-2 visa requirements. So one requirement for the E-2 visa is you have to be a national of a treaty country. This means a country that has a treaty with the United States, often for reciprocal entrepreneurial visas. So it's based on where you have a passport, not where you were born. You also have to own at least 50% of a E-2 company, which is a company based in the United States. You have to make an investment, and there must be a legitimate source of this investment. So you have to prove what is the source of your money? Is it personal savings from employment? Is it from a gift? Is it a sale of personal property? Is it a loan? We'll talk a little bit more about this later. A loan can be permitted as long as it's not secured by the assets of the E-2 company. The funds have to actually be at risk. So that means you cannot just transfer a significant lump sum of money to a business bank account and leave it there as your investment. You actually have to, spend the money on various startup expenditures or spend the money to purchase a business, as we'll talk about. So the investment amount has to be substantial, and we'll go into more detail about what substantial means. Generally, it's, what is the amount that you need to get the company up and running if you're doing a startup, or if you're purchasing a business, what is the fair market value of that business on the open market? So some typical expenditures for the E-2, if you're doing a startup, things like inventory, equipment, website, office supplies, office or warehouse rent, marketing expenditures, setting up your business entity, insurance. These are just a few of the things that you would normally spend money on. Again, you want to think about, what do I need to actually get this business to the point that it could be operational? So the investment is a little bit different when you're starting a brand new business as opposed to when you're purchasing a business. When you're starting a business, as mentioned, you have to actually spend the money on everything to get the business to the point of operating. If you're purchasing an existing business, there is an arrangement you can use called an escrow arrangement. And this helps you protect your investment a little bit more. So in this scenario, what you can do is sign a purchase sale agreement. After the purchase sale agreement is signed, you transfer the money to an independent escrow agent. The escrow agent will hold that money. And then the only condition for the transfer of the funds is the approval of the E-2 visa. If the E-2 visa is denied for some reason, then the money does not go to the seller. The escrow agent will transfer it back to you, back to the buyer. So in a purchase scenario, there is an ability to protect your investment a bit more than with a startup, but both are viable options. So another requirement is that the business cannot be marginal. And what this means is you have to hire employees in the US. So the E-2 visa is not for someone who wants to operate as a solo consultant. It's for somebody who actually wants to, develop a business in the United States, and that business needs to make a significant economic contribution and support more than just the investor and their family. The business also has to be real and operating. So that means that the business has to, if it's already taking in revenue, you're going to show things like, contracts, business bank statements. If it's a brand new company where it's not started operating yet, you're going to show things like a signed commercial lease, you've set up the business entity, you've gotten the required licenses, you've gotten a website created, maybe you have some letters of intent with some clients that have indicated they'll start working with you in the future. Also, you have to show that you are going to solely develop and direct the E2 enterprise. So again, the E2 is not for people who kind of want to come in and do this, like the operational skilled labor of the company. It's for people that want to take a higher level view and do more of the development and direction of the company, more in a CEO type of role. And then they have, employees that they've hired to do more of the operational work. Finally, this is a visa. The E-2 visa does require non-immigrant intent. So it does require you have that intent to depart the United States upon the expiration of the visa. And usually a signed statement to this effect is, sufficient to meet this requirement. The standard is a little bit lower than it is for visas like the F1 or the TN visa, where you have to prove you have a residence abroad. For the E2, you don't have to prove you have a residence abroad. You can move all of your things to the United States to live here and work for the company, but you do have to maintain that intent to depart if or when the E2 visa status ends. All right, let's talk a little bit more about some of the E-2 visa requirements. So the options for obtaining the E-2 visa, either purchasing an existing business or starting up a brand new business. So as I discussed in the last slide, some of this may depend on your risk tolerance. With purchasing an existing business, you do have a bit more ability to protect your investment. In the scenario that your E-2 visa is denied, there's that ability to get the money back as long as you haven't transferred it to the seller, if it's with the escrow agent. When you're starting a business in the United States, also a very viable option. But again, that money does have to be at risk and irrevocably committed, which often translates into spending significant money on things that may be hard to get your money back on if you end up not getting the E-2 visa. There has to be a treaty between the U.S. and a foreign country, and there's a list of treaty countries, so you can look that up online. The countries do change sometimes. Countries are removed or countries are added. In terms of countries that were added in recent years, what comes to mind: Israel, New Zealand, Portugal, all were added as E2 treaty countries in recent years. I think Iran was removed, so it is important to stay up to date on that list. And then in terms of visa validity, when you're getting a visa at a consulate abroad, the visa can be granted for a certain length of time based on something called a reciprocity schedule. So usually the US is going to grant the visa for a similar amount of time that the other country grants visas to US citizens. So there's certain countries like Canada, the United Kingdom, where you can get an E-2 visa that's valid for 5 years. There's some countries where it's less than that. Australia, it's 4 years. And there are some where it's even as low as 3 months. So Bangladesh, Egypt are countries where you can get an E-2 visa, but it's only going to be valid for 3 months. However, when you enter on the E-2 visa, you can be given 2 years in E-2 status. So you wouldn't be able to travel internationally, on that 3-month visa after the time has expired. But once you enter, you'll have 2 years to stay in the United States and run the business. Or if you needed to travel, you could go abroad and try to get a new E-2 visa stamp. All right, so a very common question: how much investment is enough? And there is no dollar figure that is set in the regulations. The E-2 is often confused with the EB-5 green card. In the EB-5, there actually is, specific set amounts that you have to invest. For the E-2, that is not the case. Substantial doesn't have any minimum set amount. It will depend on the type of the business. And what they do is they look at a proportionality test. So this is how much money have you invested versus the total cost to set up that type of business. So for these smaller investment amounts, and when I say smaller investment amounts, I mean investment amounts kind of under $250,000, you usually want to show you spent 100% of the cost to set up the business. So everything necessary to get the business to the point of being operational. When we talk about kind of huge investments, like if it's the type of company being set up really requires $100 million, to be set up, and you've invested only 10 million, even though from a proportionality perspective, the percentage of investment is lower compared to total startup costs, the magnitude of a $10 million investment still means it's likely to be found substantial. However, when we're talking about these smaller investment amounts, these kind of smaller companies, usually you need to be spending, more than that, more a higher percentage, so you couldn't say, well, total startup costs are $250,000, and I've only spent $25,000. That's not going to work. However, if you have a consulting company and you say, hey, total startup costs could be really low. I've invested $80,000 and spent 50,000 of that. Arguably, that could work as long as you can show the business has gotten, everything necessary to start operating. Things you can include to show you have invested 100% or more than 100%. Things like a CPA letter. So you could have a CPA look at your business plan. You could have a CPA look at your investment schedule. If they work with similar types of businesses, they can write an opinion letter that says, that they think this is substantial for this type of business. You can also get business articles, for example, market research or industry reports that show, normal startup costs for this type of business are, 5,000, 6,000, or some, lower amount, and show you've spent more than that. And that can be helpful as well. When you are buying a business as opposed to, starting, a startup, generally the purchase price, is going to be considered substantial, as long as it's kind of a business that's being, offered on the open market. They will want to see the company's financials to make sure that the purchase price makes sense, in light of that. If the business is showing, really strong financials and the purchase price is very low, they could certainly have questions. This is really also very relevant when you have a business purchase scenario where it's not an arm's length transaction, when you're purchasing something from a family member or from a friend. It's even more important that you're able to show that, this purchase price makes sense, that this is really the fair market value of the business. And if so, if you paid the full purchase price, this should be considered substantial. All right, let's talk about some strategies to deal with a low dollar amount. So one is you want to make sure that all the other parts of the application are as positive as possible. So if you have a low investment amount, but you're able to show that you have, significant experience running this type of business, or you've already hired employees, or you've already gotten letters of intent from clients, or you've already gotten contracts from clients. These are really positive. These speak to the real and operating requirements, the marginality requirements. And they help support the idea that you really have spent everything necessary to get the business to the point of being operational because you have all these other things in place. It can also be helpful to show good relationships with local business organizations. So, for example, if you join the local chamber of commerce, sometimes they'll write a letter that explains, that they're excited about your business, coming to their community because you're going to create, jobs and bring strong economic activity to the area. If the company has already started operating or taking in revenue, you can highlight that, in the business bank account statements or through contracts. A strong business plan is very important, especially if it's a startup with no business history. A strong business plan is really key to show that you're going to, hire workers in the United States, that you have a realistic financial plan, and just to help the officer understand what is the business, how are you going to price for your services, things like that. You could also consider getting that CPA letter, as I discussed in the previous slide about having a CPA who works in your industry, look at the investment schedule, look at the business plan, and write an opinion that they think this is a reasonable investment, a substantial investment for this type of business. All right, let's talk about some common E-2 visa expenditures. So several of them are listed here. A lot of these are things that many types of businesses would need to get up and running. Also, though, you always have to think about what type of business are you starting. So for example, one people ask about a lot is, can I include a car or a truck? So it really depends on the type of business. Let's say you're doing a food truck. Obviously, you must have a truck. That's part of your business. If you are buying a car and you're going to use the car just to kind of drive to and from work, and it's also going to be used for personal use, that usually indicates that a car is not a great expense. if you're in a, if you're in the construction industry, and you need a truck for that, if the car is going to have any type of branding or marketing on it, these are things that can indicate a car or truck could be a good expense. And then there's many other expenses listed here, that I won't, name all in detail, but you always want to think about what are the normal startup expenses for this type of business. And like making one very large expenditure, right? So setting up your business entity and then spending $80,000 on marketing, but no money in any other place is really not going to be a strong approach for the E2. You want to show that you've spent money in a variety of categories that are all relevant to getting the business set up and operational. Um, and now let's talk about some kind of bad or weak expenditures. So travel, so flights, if unless you're coming for kind of a very specific conference or business related activity, it's not a strong expense. In fact, many consulates indicate, how strongly they dislike it by saying on their website in the E2 FAQs, do not include, invoices for hotels, for flights, for food, even if it's hypothetically relevant for networking. It is something where it's just not the strongest expense. Um, similarly, taxis, entertainment. Also, if you're in the type of business where kind of you're buying something, and there's no markup and the client is immediately reimbursing you, those types of expenses can be, less strong, as well as expenses paid to related parties. And what we mean here is, let's say you own two companies, you own a software service company and then you own a company that does marketing and website development. If you pay your own company to do the website development, and it comes out that you own both companies, that's not going to look very good. Or if your, a spouse or your family member has kind of done this for you, what you want to avoid is the impression that the money is not actually being put at risk in the commercial sense, that the money is just being moved around between, companies you own. All right, let's talk about some common challenges and tips for consulting businesses. So, for a consulting business, theoretically, very low investment is needed. I'd say it's very, very common for us to have clients call and say, I want an E2, want to start a consulting company, but I just have nothing I can spend money on. I have my computer, I have my knowledge, I have my contacts. I don't need to spend money on anything else. And I think that is, that is likely accurate. But what you have to think about when you're applying for the E2 is you do have to invest a substantial amount in order to get this visa. So you kind of have to consider, okay, as an entrepreneur, obviously I want to spend as little as possible getting my business up and running. However, for purposes of getting this E2 investor visa, I have to invest a substantial amount. You have to invest enough that the officer feels comfortable that you're actually going to follow through on this plan, that you have enough on the line, that you're not going to just come into the United States on a 5-year visa and do something else. So what we usually recommend is try to think about what would your normal expenditures be over the first 1 to 2 years of operating and see if you can bring some of those expenses forward and pay for some of those now. So for example, for office space, you may not need an office space, but it's a very strong expenditure. It shows the government that you plan to have, an actual business address, where you're going to receive mail. You can prepay for 6 to 12 months sometimes of that office space. Similarly, equipment. Let's say you're going to hire, 3 employees over the first year. Maybe you purchase the computers and equipment that you need for them, before you apply for the E2. Normally, you would wait until they start. However, because this helps bolster your investment amount and you would need to spend this money anyway, you can buy this equipment, in anticipation of the employees. Investing in marketing. Especially for consulting businesses, I think one question the officers often have is, how are you going to stand out from all the other kind of consulting companies? How will clients find you? So having, maybe you were going to proceed with a very bare bones website, but instead you decide to get an upgraded one because it's a good expenditure and you were going to make that expenditure anyway in the next couple of years. Similarly with employees, maybe you were going to hold off on hiring an employee until you've been operating for a little while. But it is very strong for the case if you can hire an employee before you file. And sometimes, especially if you're outside the United States, it can be helpful to hire someone like an office manager that can just do, certain things for you in the United States that you may not be able to do yet since you don't have your visa. And then anything you pay to that employee can be included as part of the E2 expense. Notably, you can't include the employee's entire yearly salary, but you couldn't, let's say you paid them for a couple months before you file, you can include that expenditure. You can also include any related expenditures, like if you had to set up payroll, if there's kind of any insurance that you have to get. You can consider that. And then you also want to spend over, as I mentioned, a large number of categories, again, in multiple places, to convince them, yes, each element that would be needed for a business is, it has been satisfied. So I see there are some questions coming in, and we'll absolutely make time for those at the end. So let's talk about E-2 visa challenges for real estate investment companies. So anytime you're going in with real estate, you have to know that the officer is looking at that more closely. On many, many consulate websites, they have in the FAQs the specific statement that purchasing a property, putting it in the name of an LLC will not qualify. Sometimes people have the impression that they can just purchase a property and collect rental income on that property, and that would qualify for an E-2. And that's not the case. The company does have to be real and operating. You have to demonstrate that it is not an idle or speculative investment. Even the way rental income is categorized on tax returns is often passive rental income. That's not going to work for the E-2. You have to show that there's going to be enough activity that employees are needed. And so we've listed here some potential real estate ideas that have worked for clients in the past. So one is a real estate brokerage firm, real estate property management companies. So let's say you own some properties and you want to do management on those. And then you also want to do management for other properties that other people own. That can be a viable idea. Real estate renovation or construction. That's often very popular. And then house flipping, you want to be careful with this category. It can work, but only on a very large scale. Or if it's kind of combined with another one of these categories. So let's say, we had a client who was doing house flipping and they had a portfolio of about, 30 or 40 homes, or someone doing large commercial real estate development for, uh, like hundreds of millions of dollars, that is, the type of thing that can work for a real estate investment. Um, if you're doing, let's say you have a renovation and construction company, and house flipping is something you're going to do as kind of an ancillary service offering or something you're going to do on the side if you see a good investment, you can certainly work that into your business plan. You also want to make sure with real estate that you've gotten the appropriate licenses you need. So often, if you're going to do, if you're going to be a realtor, if you're going to be a brokerage, you need specific state licenses. Sometimes it's hard to get these licenses if you don't have a U.S. Social Security number. Similarly, with renovation or construction, you might need a general contractor's license. These are the types of things where you may need to kind of have a business relationship, maybe with either an employee or with another business, that'll help with that licensing until you get to the point when you can actually obtain that license for yourself. All right, let's talk a little bit about equity trading companies. I'd say a lot of the same concerns for real estate follow for equity trading companies. So again, kind of placing your stock portfolio in an LLC will not qualify. You have to show there's going to be enough activity to actually employ people in the United States. Your clients should go beyond your friends and family. You want to show like how are you going to get clients? And then this is a very highly regulated industry. You need to show you have the proper licenses. Sometimes, especially if there's kind of a hedge fund scenario, there might be multiple competing entities. So you need to work with an attorney to think about, which entity is going to be the E-2 entity, where is the revenue going to come, where are we going to hold the employees, where will there be sufficient activity to show this is a viable company. All right, let's talk about some reasons for E-2 denials. One is low investment amount. And as we've discussed during this presentation, there's many things you can do, to try to mitigate the impact of a low investment amount. However, there are some investment amounts that are just going to be too low. We had a client come to us, they had spent $2,000 and put $98,000 in a business bank account. That investment amount is just too low. They're not going to believe that you have committed a significant enough amount of money, to ensure your commitment to developing and directing the enterprise. So you do have to also, consider where you're applying. So we'll talk about that, in a later bullet point. Also want to consider nature of the business. This can be a reason for an E2 denial. As we've discussed kind of some risky business types during this presentation. So if you're going in and you have a consulting company, you're in a real estate, project, you have an equity trading company, these are ones where you inherently know there's going to be more scrutiny, and you have to convince the officer that you meet the requirements. Filing location, venue is very important. Even though the law is the same, ultimately, each consulate kind of has their own ideas about how they implement the law. And there are some consulates that are very used to seeing large multinational companies as opposed to small investors. So at those consulates, when they see an investment of $100,000, they're much less likely to be friendly to that investment, because they're so used to seeing investments in that are millions of dollars or more. There are many consulates that are very friendly to small investment amounts, but you do have to work with your attorney to understand where are those, and then do you have the ability to apply there. So, for example, the consulate in Toronto, the consulate in London, these consulates are generally quite friendly to lower investment amounts. If you file for a change of status with U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, they also are friendlier to low investment amounts, although, of course, that has to make sense in light of the type of business you're starting. Um, these second bullet points are kind of related. So other reasons for denials, if they don't believe that you're going to create jobs. So if you have run a very similar company, let's say you've been a solo consultant for 20 years in your home country, and now you're saying you want to come to the US and run a consulting company, they may not believe, just based on a business plan, that you actually intend to hire workers because your history shows that you never have. So in that type of circumstance, it can be really beneficial, to actually hire somebody before you file, just to head off that concern, before they get to it. Another reason for a denial could be an issue with the adjudicating officer. So consular officers are human beings. They have a range of experience. You may get a very experienced officer, a less experienced officer. Sometimes officers get in their head certain things about, what their requirements are. Sometimes those things are not correct. If you do have a situation where the officer you feel really incorrect or very rude, unfortunately, they do have complete discretion over whether to grant or deny the visa. So at that point, you do have to, be as respectful as possible. Try to ask for whatever information, they're willing to give you about why they're denying. And then there's always the ability to reapply. And although it's not guaranteed, most consulates will try to give you a different officer, at the time that you reapply. Another is just you didn't meet the requirements at the time of filing. Let's say, you don't own 50% of the company, or the money is all in your personal bank account and nothing has been spent yet. So sometimes we do see that happening where people, perhaps think they have an understanding of what the requirements are, but they apply and, requirements are not met. Again, like often in those cases, there's an ability to mitigate that, revisit the application, make sure you meet the requirements, and then, resubmit. All right, let's talk about some E2 adjudication trends. Approval rates are generally quite high for E2 visas across the board. The government posted approval rates are between 80 to 90%. Our approval rate is about 98%, although, of course, past results do not predict future outcomes. We can never guarantee that there's going to be a visa approval. In terms of timelines, some consulate, London right now, they report publicly a review time of 60 business days. Our experience is it's taking a little longer than that. From the time you submit the case, kind of taking closer to maybe 70, 80, sometimes even 90 days, and then they'll call you for an interview. Toronto, they're relatively fast, taking between 10 to 15 business days to review the case and then allow applicants to schedule their interview, and they can usually get the interview within a couple weeks. And then generally, timelines, are all over the place. So, thankfully, we're, really starting to see that the COVID delays are finally fully subsiding, but that's not true everywhere. So there's many consulates that are fully back to how they were, in terms of E2 visa processing timelines, London, Toronto, Japan, like there's many places that are. There's some places that really are still playing catch up. The consulates and, the US consulates in Turkey, the US consulate in Colombia, they are still struggling to get a reasonable time frame. So when you're applying at certain consulates, it's not uncommon to see, wait times of several months, or even longer. So unfortunately, it has been very, very inconsistent, when consulates are kind of coming back to normal processing times, and what is normal really varies, within each consulate. Let's talk about USCIS filings versus filings at a consulate. So, if you are in the United States in a valid status that allows you to change your status, you can file for a change of status to E-2 with U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services. A few things to keep in mind with this. So, one is you're not going to get a visa stamp that allows you to travel internationally. What you'll get is an approval that allows you to change your status and stay in the United States for a 2-year period running the company. If you have to travel, let's say 1 year, out at the 1 year mark, you have a family emergency, you have to travel outside the US, you're not going to be able to re-enter the United States using that approval notice. You will have to go to a US consulate and resubmit a brand new E-2 visa application to try to get the E-2 visa stamp. And importantly, the consulate does not have to rely on the approval from USCIS. So there are some visas in the United States, like the H-1B or the O or the L, where you submit to USCIS, and if you get an approval, when you go to the consulate, it's almost like a rubber stamp. They're doing a credibility check on certain aspects of the petition, but they are not re-adjudicating the basic requirements for the visa. That is not the case for an E-2. With an E-2 visa, you actually will be, when you go to the consulate, submitting a brand new application. They will look at it as a case of first impression. And although they may consider the USCIS approval, it does not mean that you will be granted the visa. They will make their own determination. Um, Another thing to consider with USCIS is just that they have a very strict requirement for the source and trail of funds, whereas consulates tend to take a more high level view. So if you have a very complex source and trail of funds, if your money was transferred to multiple different accounts, if it comes from multiple different people, a consular filing may be better for you because USCIS will take a very hardline approach to that. That's also the case with licensing. So USCIS focuses a lot on licenses and it asks for proof that you've met all licensing requirements or proof that you don't need the licenses. Whereas at consulates, again, they take a much more high level view of this. So let's talk a little bit about consular filings. So the benefit of a consular filing is you're actually going to get a visa stamp in your passport. And for many people, that means a multiple entry, multi-year visa. And each time you enter the US, you'll get 2 years in E-2 investor status. But you can continue to travel for that, 3, 4, 5 year period, and then you can renew the visa in those increments. Additionally, again, consulates, they take a more high level view of the source and trail of funds, which can often be beneficial. And as well, you have an interview. So you do have the ability to kind of explain any questions and kind of argue for your case. Um, Thinking about kind of post-specific considerations, each consulate, similar to the way the timelines will vary a lot between consulates, what they want, the way they want it presented, what their, filing requirements are. These really change a lot, between consulates. So you always need to look at the website to see what are the consular instructions. Over the past several years, it's the submission requirements have changed. Many consulates used to ask for paper filings. Now, most consulates, it's through email and they have very specific requirements about how they want things. There's also, consular preferences, right? So as I mentioned, there are some consulates that are very used to seeing huge companies. There's some consulates that are much more familiar with small business owners. So you do want to take that into account. And then one trend we're seeing as well is, there's some consulates where for your business plan, which is very important for a startup, they actually want a CPA to sign off on this and to certify the plan. And at our firm, we do offer the service of drafting the business plans. And additionally, we have a CPA on staff who can certify the business plan. All right, let's talk about some of the issues and complex areas that come up with E-2 visas. So, one common question, do I have to hire employees before I apply for the E-2 visa? And the answer is no, it's not required in the regulations. That being said, there are some consulates, and this kind of seems to be, it goes through trends at various consulates where certain officers will, tell applicants this, so ones that come to mind are consulates in Brazil and in Taiwan um, where they'll say, well, you have to have employees. And again, this is not required. It's clear in the regulations this isn't required, especially in a startup scenario, but certainly it does help. And if you are applying at a consulate where you know that the officers have that in their mind, obviously beneficial to hire an employee before you file. Complicated source and trail of funds. So this is particularly complex when you're doing a USCIS filing for a change of status. Um, as I mentioned, they'll want to see an exacting source and trail of funds. So that means even if you say, well, I earned this money over 20 years, they're going to want to see tax returns, for maybe every year. If it's, money that was accumulated over time through your payroll, they'll want to see the payroll stubs. They'll want to see the bank statement showing your payroll entering your bank account and being sustained there. Right. So if you say, oh, well, it all comes from my payroll, but then your bank statement shows that your payroll was put into your bank account and then you spent it on non E2 expenditures, they're not going to accept that. Whereas if you go to a consulate, and you say it's from my personal savings, they may just ask to see, 3 years of tax returns and your bank statement showing the lump sum transfer. So it is very different. Let's talk about loans. So loans are permitted as long as they are either unsecured or secured only by the applicant's personal assets. What you cannot do is you cannot take out a loan that is secured by the assets of the E2 company. This comes up a lot in kind of seller financing situations where if you're purchasing a business and some percentage of that is seller financing. So in that scenario, most of the time, the seller financing is based on, it's secured by the E2 business. So that does not work. If you're going to use a loan to fund it, it needs to either be an unsecured personal loan, or let's say you own a home, you take out, a line of credit or a home equity loan or a second mortgage, that can work as well. So all things to keep in mind. Gifts. So gifts are permitted as well. However, you have to keep in mind that let's say you have a gift letter and it's your mother's giving you money from her personal savings from employment. Your mother still needs to be willing to provide her tax return. She still needs to be willing to provide all the financial documents to show the funds come from a legitimate source. So if you're getting a gift, you have to make sure in advance that the person is comfortable sharing their financial documentation, because you cannot just submit a gift letter. The government won't accept just the gift letter. Um, People often ask, can I get, E2 visas for two investors? And yes, you can, as long as you own the company 50-50. If it's a scenario, let's say it's two Canadian investors, you have the same nationality and you want to own it 60-40, that potentially can work, but the 40% owner would need to come in as an E2 employee as opposed to an investor. Um, Substantive changes to the E2 business after filing. Sometimes clients, people will come to us or do a consult and say, once I had my visa, I thought I could just do anything. And this is not the case. So you do have to pay attention to changes in ownership and changes into your type of business. So even if you have a 5-year visa, if your ownership falls below 50% during that 5-year period, technically you no longer operationally control the company, technically your visa is really not valid anymore. Similarly, if you sell your company, you're no longer working there and you still have your valid E2 visa, you've sold the company, your visa is not valid anymore. Also, if there's substantial changes to the type of business, so let's say that you started up a wedding photography business and now you want to close it down and run a restaurant. So that in order to do that, you have to go back to the consulate or to USCIS and explain the substantial change and get an approval before you make that change. So you cannot just change the type of business completely without getting an approval first. However, if there's like a natural change in your business or the change has been contemplated in the business plan, let's say in the business plan you said you were going to do software service, IT consulting, but you also were going to do mobile app development starting in year 3 or 4, and then the mobile app development takes off and software consulting becomes less of your revenue, that's okay because you contemplated it in your business plan. So I think the important takeaway is just the E2 allows you to perform and work at the business that you represented to the consulate. And if there's going to be major changes to that type of business, you need to go back and get an approval before those changes can start. Something else to discuss, just family business purchases. If you are purchasing a business from a family member, there's going to be a lot more scrutiny on that. There are, many officers who will inherently think that the purchase price is maybe not the fair market value. So it can be beneficial to get a valuation. It can be beneficial maybe to have a CPA look over the financials and opine that the purchase price did make sense. And you just know you're going to go in kind of having more scrutiny on your case. All right. So we have reached the end of the slides, and I see we do have some questions. So we'll start to run through these now. So somebody asked, buying 70% of shares worth 200 of existing business, C Corp would this qualify for an E2 business? So if you're buying a majority of, a business, so 70% would be, over the majority, 50%, and it's 200,000, and that is the fair market value for that, those shares, then yes, that could work. Is it advisable to have a C Corp if you're eventually planning to add other businesses? Generally, yes. Like if you're going to have kind of a more formal structure with, multiple partners, a C Corp often does make sense. Someone's asked, can we include flight ticket and hotel expenses if you have to travel to another state for business training? Again, these are very weak expenditures. We don't recommend them. Hotel expenses we never include. Flight expenses maybe, but generally no. I'd say they're weak expenditures. You really want to focus on other expenditures. There is someone's asked, is there a limit to how many times the E2 visa can be renewed? And the answer is no. It can be renewed indefinitely. So, hypothetically, as long as you're continuing to meet the requirements, as long as the company is continuing to run, you can keep renewing the E2 visa. Are you allowed to expand the business through future mergers and acquisitions? So I kind of just covered this with the substantial changes. So yes, hypothetically, you can expand the business. However, you have to keep in mind both the ownership and what the company is doing. Does it align with what you submitted to the consulate? If not, maybe you need to go back and get a new approval before you can go ahead with that. Are you allowed to borrow U.S. small business administration loans in the case of purchasing a business? So I think that that's really going to depend on like a lot of different parameters. That's something where you would actually need to, I think set up a consultation to discuss that. It's really going to depend, on what the requirements of the loan program are. And again, whether or not this is a personal loan, for like that's your personal funds that are at risk. Someone's asked, what are the issues with franchise businesses? So this is a very broad question. Franchises can be purchased for the E2. Some general high-level things to keep in mind are what are the rules, right? So can you, as a non-U.S. citizen, non-green card holder, own a majority of that business? Some franchises have restrictions on that. How much leeway does the franchise give you to develop and direct the business? That's something to keep in mind. Have you paid the proper franchise fees? So these are all things to consider with franchises, but they are viable ways to get the E2 visa. To what extent can personal credit cards be used to show investment for the E2? So personal credit cards can be used. We generally treat them essentially as an unsecured loan, right? It's a line of credit. Can a wife use her husband's credit card for E2 expenditures? Yes, you can. Usually kind of we'll describe it as, perhaps it's a gift, from the husband to the wife. One thing to keep in mind though is that if you're funding the business primarily through unsecured credit, they could ask the question, is the business too highly leveraged? Will you have sufficient cash flow to actually run this business in a realistic way? So, some amount of expenditures on personal credit cards are generally fine, but using it as your sole mechanism, can sometimes run into issues where they'll ask, have you paid off these credit cards? If you've paid off the credit cards, how much, like where did you get the money to pay off the credit cards? Someone's asked if my friend from Canada and the US offers me financial help as a gift to reach the substantial mark. Do they have to provide supporting documents? Yes, they do. So anybody who gifts you money, you do need to provide the source of that gift. So, just a bank statement's not enough. So where did they get the money? Did they earn it from employment? Is it from sale of property? How did they get the money? So they will have to provide that. Someone said, I'm working to start my food truck. Working capital is up to 50 and my investment is up to 70. Is this a substantial investment amount? So again, depends on whether you have everything necessary to get the business up and running. Is the food truck fully fitted out? Do you have all the proper licenses? Is the marketing in place? Is the insurance in place? These are the things you want to be, thinking about. Generally, having an investment with 50,000 working capital, 70,000 spent. For example, in Toronto, often this would be sufficient, but it does go back to, have you spent everything necessary for this particular type of business? Someone's asked if you've already lived in the US on a TN visa, but you want to change to E2, can you apply at the consulate? Yes, you can. Even if you're in the US on a valid visa, you can still apply at the consulate. It does not have to be through USCIS. And if you are Canadian, or Mexican living in the United States, I think often more beneficial to apply at the consulate. You're going to get a visa stamp that allows you to travel. There may be considerations that might make USCIS better, but those would be discussed during a consult. How much is the minimum to invest for a food truck in Los Angeles? We'll sell French food. So I can't, again, I can't give you a minimum. It goes back to what I've been saying the entire time, which is, have you spent everything necessary to get that you can convince an officer you've gotten the business to the point of being operational? Have you purchased the food truck? Have you fitted it out? Have you gotten your licenses? Things like that. So someone's asked about our fees for the business plans. So to the extent you have questions on fees, please feel free to reach out to us directly, and we're happy to discuss those on a consult or through email. Once approved for an E2, are you permitted to leave the US to fly home to your home country occasionally? If you have a valid E2 visa stamp in your passport, yes. If you did a change of status with USCIS, then no. That approval notice alone is not going to be enough to allow you to travel internationally. Someone says, I have a friend with an E2 visa. Can I get into his business and also get an E2 visa? Potentially. If you have the same nationality and he wants to hire you as an E2 employee in an executive, supervisory, managerial, or essential specialized skills role, then you could be an E2 employee. If you want to, be an E2 investor, you want to purchase 50% of the business, that's another potential way. Buyer and seller have the last name but are not related. Can that create more scrutiny? Yes, it can, but you just need to explain that they're not related, even though they have the same last name. Can a family member take a loan and gift the loan amount to the E2 applicant? Yes, they can. You will need to so let's say that your mother takes out an unsecured line of credit from her bank. You'd want the line of credit documentation from the bank, the proof of that money entering her bank account, the proof of her transferring that money to you, the proof of you transferring that money to your E2 business bank account, and then a gift letter as well. Is it better to apply from the US if I'm in the States on a visitor visa, or apply from Canada? If we do the change of status and we leave, do we have to apply again? So usually if somebody is Canadian, again and again, there can be strategy factors that change this analysis, but usually if someone is Canadian, we would recommend applying at the consulate. They're quite friendly to small business owners, and you can get a 5-year visa that allows you to travel internationally. If you do a change of status, you're going to get a 2-year approval notice, and you cannot leave the country and come back in without going back to the consulate and getting a E2 visa stamp. Any advice on reapplication with your firm in terms of expertise? So I'm not sure exactly what this is asking, but I will say that we have had clients come to us who used other attorneys and were denied, and we've reapplied for them and it's been successful. We've also had situations where, our clients have been denied and we reapply and it's been successful. There are certain factors that are very hard to overcome, right? So if you go in and they believe you have immigrant intent or they think you're lying, those are going to be really, really hard reapplications. But we do deal with it. And so if you're in a situation where you want to reapply, you can always set up a consult with us and we can do an assessment. Can we invest in the family operated small business LLC? Yes, as I discussed in the last slide, it's possible to do that, but you're going to have a lot of scrutiny if it's a family situation. So you need to get a valuation, have business attorneys draft the purchase sale agreements, kind of put the right things in place so that they believe this is a legitimate business transaction. Any ideas of times for Latin American consulates? It really varies. So I don't have those timelines off the top of my head. I would say you can always check the US consulate websites. They sometimes make it publicly available. They sometimes don't. It's not, and even when it's publicly available, like for example, with London, they say 60 working days. It's more like 90. Some of them, but there is a huge range as to how fast they are. Again, like Bogota is very, very delayed. Brazil is pretty reasonable. So it really is kind of all over the place. What is the minimum amount of employees to hire? So no minimum amount. However, I do recommend at least 3 to 5 employees hired by year 5. I've noticed that if somebody, for example, buys like a small postal or, shipping company that only ever has, 2 part-time employees or, 1 employee, those are very hard to get approved. Would the escrow agent be the lawyer? So generally, no. Usually you want to have an independent escrow agent who's not representing the buyer or the seller so that the money is kind of truly neutral. And then if the E-2 visa is approved, it goes to the seller. If it's denied, it goes back to the buyer. Is 50,000 a substantial amount? So again, I'll be moving equipment worth over 50 to the country. Again, like as we've discussed throughout this process, it's going to depend on the type of business you're starting. Have you spent in a variety of categories? Have you spent everything necessary to get the business up and running? And also, where are you applying? Can my adult son be an E-2 employee in my business? Yes, this is possible, assuming that your son has the experience that makes it, so if your son has just finished college and has no relevant experience, that's going to be a much harder application than if your son has been working in this area for some length of time and, arguably could have that either those essential skills role or that, executive managerial or supervisory role. Can we choose the consulate to apply? If we live in Alberta, can we apply in Toronto, or is it closest to one to where you live? So if you are if you're a Canadian citizen and you're doing a first time E-2 application, it has to go through Toronto. They don't allow you to do it anywhere else. Um, and can we show investment in cryptocurrency and Robinhood as available working capital to strengthen our case? Um, I think that generally, if you want the working capital to be attributed to the business, it needs to be in the E-2 business bank account. That's not to say you can't kind of try to bring in these more speculative investments, but I think it's weaker, especially if it's something where it's just sitting in a personal account and not actually committed to the business. Um, any tips about the Paris consulate? This is very, very broad. I'd say, like the Paris consulate does regularly process E-2 visas. Um, you know, Higher investment amounts are a little bit better there, like than other places. Um, they do have I'd say, a streamlined process. So they are a consulate that's more familiar with E-2 visas. There are some consulates that really don't process them very much. But generally can be a good E-2 consulate, although as with any consulate over the years, as consular officers change in and out, sometimes it's harder, sometimes it's better. Um, so we have reached the end of the presentation and we've finished all the questions. Thank you everyone for your participation and your great questions. I hope everyone has a wonderful day. Thank you.